All right, part 2 of our review for the final exam and focusing on the many versions of you in the multiverse. So we have seen throughout this course that our culture does, in fact, play a huge role in our development. And so in this review, we will focus on the effect of culture and in the role that it plays in human development. So in one study, if you recall, this was one of the studies that we've covered about white Americans and comparing white Americans with Latin Americans youth. The researchers had looked at the brain responses to two activities, helping your family with money and earning money for yourself. So the hypothesis, if you recall, was that the Latin American young people will process the act of helping their family as more rewarding, at least on the neurophysiological level. The researchers measured the subject's brain activation during these acts using fMRI. And in fact, they did find that the areas of the brain that they hypothesized would be associated with experiencing a reward was in fact activated more so in Latin American youth when they were winning or giving money to their family. However, whereas the same areas were more activated in the white American young participants when they were winning money for themselves. However, it is important to point out that the study found that both groups showed no differences in the frequency of giving money to themselves or their family members. So behaviorally, they did not differ. Cognitive development can be affected by culture as well. For example, using the information processing approach, the researchers in a study, again, we've covered that study, of bilingual and monolingual 7-month-old babies found that bilingual babies as early as 7 months has already developed better cognitive inhibition compared to monolingual babies. Let's recall that cognitive inhibition is part of our executive function, which is an umbrella under which the other important cognitive systems allow us to guide our behavior and thoughts at our own will in a goal-directed fashion. So cognitive inhibition is just one part of that process. Children or adults who demonstrate better cognitive control are also better at reasoning, problem solving, and tend to have higher IQ. Studies also show that cognitive control is more important for school readiness than IQ itself. Two specific processes go into cognitive control. Let's recall that. Working memory, I emphasized in one of my lecture, and ability to suppress irrelevant responses, also known as cognitive inhibition. And so as early as in infancy, children show ability to suppress attention and produce or suppress a response, a cognitive response to, and produce task relevant responses to another stimuli. So if you present 2 or more stimuli, babies are already have the ability to suppress, focus on one particular stimulus and respond to that appropriately. But also we do know that the children show individual differences in this ability, so keep that in mind. Now let's recall Vygotsky theory of cognitive development. In fact, his theory is focused on culture and differences or how the social cultural factors affect cognitive development. And he focused on cultural artifacts. Those could be physical or abstract, like ideas, values. You could call them cultural artifacts. Of course, physical buildings are physical artifacts. All of those things influence cognitive development. I would also add that these differences can be quantitative, as in some children will be more cognitively advanced, for example, if they received more support and scaffolding, remember that term, but also qualitatively, as in different ways of thinking, depending on where you grew up. So Vygotsky doesn't say that the more of social activities you do, the better cognitively. What he says is that the kinds of activities or the kinds of cultural artifacts you're exposed to, that affects qualitatively your cognition. So it's not simply the more the better, it's what of those things are you exposed to. And of course, he also emphasized the knowledgeable adults or peers in scaffolding cognitive development in children. Our culture influences our moral development. For example, studies using the moral foundation theory suggest that collectivistic cultures tend to prioritize group loyalty, authority, and purity. Those are 3 of the 5 of moral intuitions, according to this theory. They prioritize them to a higher degree than, say, individualistic culture. So individualistic cultures show high preferences for 2 specific moral intuitions: care, harm, and fairness. So altogether, there are 5 basic moral intuitions according to this theory. Of course, other theories will have suggested more, but a moral foundation theory highlights 5 basic moral foundations, or intuitions, they call them. Here's another study that we've covered. It's a 2008 study by Herman and colleagues. And the study, or the procedures, or the methodology, I guess you could call it, is commonly known as the public good game experiment, where differences in punishment and cooperation behavior were compared. And so what the study found was that societies with weaker institutions seem to develop more distrust. And that distrust is reflected in just simply how the participants played that game, and specifically in the frequencies of antisocial punishment that they displayed during the game. I don't want to go into the details of the study, but you could go back and refresh your memory on the details of the study. But I would say that's the biggest takeaway from this experiment, that the specifically the differences antisocial punishments. Here's another one. Religion typically is not associated strongly with culture, but it can produce culture, generate culture, right? And so it can also definitely influence values and moral judgments that people develop. And so one of the study that I described also in module 1, very first module, this was specifically looking at Protestants versus Catholics. And the study found that Protestants made more dispositional biases than Catholics. And the explanation was that because Protestant beliefs focus more on human soul, innateness, at the center of people's being. And so it will be used to essentially more often to explain people's immoral behavior, right? To look into people's soul and explain that there's something wrong with people's soul, or they're innately something wrong with people if they do some sort of immoral acts. And that is a dispositional bias. When it comes to our beliefs about what it means to be a man or a woman, for example, our culture plays also a significant role, according to social constructionist and the biosocial perspectives. So remember, there are multiple perspectives, but the social constructionist and biosocial perspectives do attribute some more than the other to culture. Although the biosocial perspective also claims that our biological sex will influence our gender-related behaviors and role that we attribute to men and women. But again, according to both, our culture does shape how we view, say, masculine and feminine traits and what we believe to be acceptable, say, for men or women, what's their roles and their behavior. The evolutionary perspectives assumes that the differences stem from selection and reproduction pressure. So those are selection and reproduction pressures do differ for men and women, due largely to biological differences. Of course, if we look at evidence, scientific evidence, that there's evidence for both, that biological influences our gender roles and behavior, but also cultural influences. So this review suggests that the versions of you who would grow up in different culture are most likely to be different in how your brain processes information, so cognitive, and also how we make judgments and how moral or immoral we would become. So I guess according to, if we look at that, then yes, you would be very different. Your version of you would be very different in various multiverses.